Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence will come to order. Without objection, the subcommittee may recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to conduct oversight of the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, that will be referred to as INA, and hear from Undersecretary for INA, Mr. Kenneth Weinstein. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. We're holding this important hearing to examine and discuss the role of DHS's Office of INA that helps play a role in safeguarding our nation. The United States faces a myriad of threats from state and non-state actors. We're seeing authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, and Iran expand their reach across the globe and challenge the sovereignty of the United States and our allies. Our adversaries are not only working to achieve these objectives through conventional military means, but are also masterfully accomplishing these goals through cyberspace and by using asymmetric tactics that fall just below the threshold of traditional conflict, more commonly known as gray zone aggression. We have seen malign actors utilize state-owned companies and their technological products to spy on our nation and gather sensitive data that advances their strategic goals. Further, the threats posed by violent extremist groups like ISIS, al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda, and others that continue to operate throughout sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia present consistent challenges. Overall, the threats posed by state and non-state actors paired with the department's failure to secure our borders have led our nation down a precarious path that presents a clear and present danger. Our nation has almost certainly not seen this level of instability since World War II, and these threats will only continue to metastasize if we don't do something about it and stop the aggression from our adversaries. I highlight the troubling developments because they show why now more than ever our nation needs an effective and efficient intelligence enterprise to keep the homeland safe, secure, and resilient while not abusing its authorities or violating the constitutional rights of Americans. The men and women that work within INA are charged with disseminating intelligence to state, local, tribal, and territorial enforcement agencies and other partners and develop intelligence from those partners for DHS and the IC to ensure our communities stay safe. Over the years and across administrations, INA has struggled at times to complete its mission to equip the Homeland Security enterprise with timely intelligence and information needed to keep the homeland safe. Systematic and documented failures, as detailed by various reports by the DHS Inspector Generals, have led to breakdowns in identifying specific threat streams or have undermined public trust. For instance, INA's overt human intelligence collection program has raised serious questions and concerns related to the department's overreach of its statutory mandate and to potential violations of the fundamental civil liberties of all Americans. In fact, part of the program was paused after a number of DHS officials raised concern about its legality. These issues have led to high turnover, no clear leadership or effective oversight, and significant training gaps for its employees. These incidents within DHS are unacceptable and erode trust in keeping our nation safe at a time when our country faces an elevated threat. It did not help when DHS unilaterally decided to establish a now disbanded Homeland Intelligence Expert Group, an action that continues to raise concerns about DHS's impartiality and objectivity in furthering its Homeland Security mission amidst ever-evolving threats. These concerns were further exacerbated when DHS then decided to rebrand the discredited experts group as an advisory board, claiming that the new board builds upon the experts group and will represent diverse perspectives without regard for political affiliation. In an effort to address some of these shortcomings within INA, members of this committee have not only conducted oversight of INA's operations, but also passed various bipartisan legislative measures designed to improve training and transparency of INA's activities. Today, I've asked Undersecretary Weinstein to provide us with an update on the steps that the department has taken to address the long-standing issues associated with INA that cannot be fixed with surface-level patches. I'm encouraged to hear that INA has been undergoing an internal review, and we thank Mr. Weinstein for doing that, and a reorganization as well. But it simply can't be a reshuffling of leadership roles or just to give the appearance of progress. We have talked several times throughout the last year about some of these issues. I've worked with the ranking member, Mr. Magaziner. This subcommittee has worked on truly identifying and having a conversation that highlights some of the past, what I would call failures, but also looks forward to what can be done to keep our nation safe. As we approach the anniversary of 9/11, the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that in the days leading up to 9/11, the phrase, "the system was blinking red," was brought up. That was part of the 9/11 Commission. It was part of the findings, and it's part of what I want to frame this subcommittee hearing today, is that I am fearful and concerned today that the system is blinking red in a number of ways. And I think that even if our intention is to keep this country safe, we have to look under the hood and get to an organization, and I appreciate you being here doing that, so that if it is blinking red, which I think it is, that we can get the oversight done, provide DHS with the appropriate resources to keep the country safe so that we don't have another incident like 9/11 again. And I appreciate you being here. I look forward to hearing your testimony. And I now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, the ranking member, Mr. Magaziner.
Well, thank you, Chairman Pfluger, for calling today's hearing, and also for the constructive conversations that we've been having around ways that we can support your efforts to reform and enhance the effectiveness of the office. And thank you, Undersecretary Weinstein, for joining us this afternoon. Today's conversation has to start with remembering why the Office of Intelligence and Analysis was created. The terror attacks that took place on September 11th, 2001. I remember that day vividly, and I'm sure everyone else here does as well. And the failures that allowed it to happen were in large part due to the lack of coordination and information sharing at the time between intelligence agencies and law enforcement. The terrorism threat that INA was created to combat persists today, as does our mission of overseeing the integration of DHS with the intelligence, between the intelligence community and law enforcement. We are aware of some of the challenges that INA has experienced, but I do want to also highlight the good work that people there are doing every day to keep America safe, and to a degree, the success of INA can also be measured in the terror attacks that have not taken place over the last 2 decades. That being said, there are challenges that need to be addressed, and I am pleased that the Undersecretary has undertaken a 360-degree review of the organization to realign the structure and improve the performance of INA. But the work continues to assess how INA meets its intelligence mission and ensure that it complies with important privacy and First Amendment and oversight requirements. INA plays a critical role in protecting the American people from violence by collecting, analyzing, and disseminating intelligence to state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector law enforcement. It is the only intelligence community member tasked with providing actionable intelligence to these partners. INA's critical role in helping to secure the homeland is more necessary today than ever because the United States faces a wide variety of threats, both domestic and international, from state and non-state actors. For example, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, including those motivated by white supremacy, pose a significant threat to our country, according to FBI data. They commit mass shootings and other violent acts to advance their racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and bigoted agendas. At the same time, Secretary Mayorkas recently warned that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other foreign terrorist organizations are once again increasingly recruiting and plotting attacks against Americans at home and abroad. These are serious threats that require our intelligence community and our law enforcement agencies to work together to share information, to have access to timely, actionable intelligence to do their jobs on the ground. I look forward to hearing more about the results of the 360-degree review for INA and the steps that are being taken to help INA regain its status as a trusted intelligence partner, and learning what Congress can do to ensure that INA's critical mission is carried out to its fullest with respect to privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. With that, I yield back. I thank you again for being here, and I thank the chairman.
I thank the ranking member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'd like to welcome and thank the Undersecretary, Mr. Weinstein, for being here today. I ask that our witness please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated, and let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. I'd now like to formally introduce Undersecretary Kenneth Weinstein, who serves as the Department of Homeland Security's Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis. He's responsible for providing the Secretary, DHS leadership, and all the components thereof, and private sector partners with the Homeland Security intelligence and information needed to keep the country safe, secure, and resilient. The Office of INA is a member of and the Department's liaison to the United States intelligence community. Mr. Weinstein serves as the Chief Intelligence Officer for DHS and reports directly to the DHS Secretary and Director of National Intelligence. Prior to his confirmation, Mr. Weinstein spent over 20 years in law enforcement and national security positions in the federal government. Between 1989 and 2001, Mr. Weinstein served as a federal prosecutor and held a variety of supervisory positions. In 2006, Mr. Weinstein was confirmed as the first Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. In that position, Mr. Weinstein established and led the new National Security Division, which consolidated the Justice Department's law enforcement and intelligence operations on all national security matters. And in 2008, he was named Homeland Security Advisor by President George W. Bush. And I know for a fact that you come into this job because you love this country and want to see the security of our country as the utmost priority. I appreciate you being here, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Weinstein for your opening testimony.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. Thank you also for holding the roundtable that you held a couple months back about INA, and also thank you for your sustained interest in INA and its mission. And thank you for for both of your opening remarks, because they frame the issue and the challenge very well for the rest of the hearing. I'd like to frame today's remarks as an update to my last testimony to this committee back in December 2022, which is about 6 months or so after I started in this position. In that hearing, I previewed our plans for significant change at INA, and in the last 18 months since then, we put those plans in place and into action. We've done that through what you referenced, our INA 360 review, which has been a rigorous re-examination and reassessment and reprioritization of our operations that has proceeded in 3 stages, the third and final stage of which we just announced and shared with Congress in April of this year. I'd like to take my time today to give you an overview of this process, because I think it's the best way to illustrate the depth of the change that is underway here at INA, and to address your very valid concern that the change is real and deep. It isn't just reshuffling the deck chairs. So in terms of the 3 stages, the first stage that we went through, implemented last May, was a reorganization that reprioritized 4 areas of operations within INA, with the creation of new organizational structures to lead each area. We created an Office of Partnerships to enhance the critical liaison work we do with our state, local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners. I'll refer to them as our SLTTP partners. We created an Office of Collection to enhance supervision of our collection activities, an issue that you referenced earlier. We created an Intelligence Enterprise Program Office to enhance our coordination of the intelligence elements of all the DHS components. And finally, and very importantly, we created a Transparency and Oversight Program Office to enhance our ability to protect privacy and civil liberties in our intelligence operations. So that was the first stage, the organizational stage. The second was the topical stage that involved reprioritizing the intelligence topics that we pursue, and then producing, for the first time in over a decade, a Homeland Intelligence Priorities Framework, which is a prioritized list of threat topics along the lines of the DNI's annual National Intelligence Priorities Framework. That framework now serves as an overarching strategic document that guides all of our intelligence activities. The third stage of our review was the functional stage that involved examining the utility of the various functions within our organization against 4 operating principles. We developed these principles in consultation with our partners, including with you all on the Hill, and it's worth taking a minute on them as they show the direction that we're taking the organization. Those guiding principles are the following. First, that while we serve many different intelligence customers from the President of the United States on down, Our primary external intelligence customers are SLTTP partners. In other words, it is their intelligence needs that are our primary concern. Second, that we serve those partners' needs primarily by providing them not with tactical law enforcement type of intelligence, but instead with strategic level threat intelligence that helps to inform their decision-making as officials and policymakers out in their jurisdictions. Third, that we focus our resources and operations on those areas where we at INA have distinct operational advantages and defer to other IC agencies where we do not. And fourth, that we continually strive to build strong management into our organization and into our culture. So based on those four principles, we've developed and announced and are now implementing about 30 different functional initiatives across INA. As one example, to advance our service to our primary SLTTP customers, per the first principle, we're restructuring our field operation around the country to make it more responsive to the needs of those customers. And we're also starting a program that will embed state and local officers and private sector representatives within the ranks of INA. Next, to enhance our strategic focus, we're embedding our open source collectors within our analytics centers to more directly tether their collection to each center's strategic analytic efforts. To leverage one of our distinct operational advantages, i.e. our intra-DHS relationship with CBP and ICE, we're embedding personnel within those components to access and generate intelligence reports about the fentanyl-related data in their systems. And we're also, importantly, teaming our human collectors up with CBP personnel to conduct field interviews along the southwest border. And finally, to improve the management support for our workforce, we've created a substantial slate of new training programs for current and future managers. So those are just a few examples of the significant change that is underway at INA. And as I wind up, let me take a moment to give well-deserved kudos to the workforce at INA. Change like this isn't easy, and our workforce has really been stepping up and leaning into it. And as you know, openness to change is not something that's everywhere in government, but it is here in INA. And that's one of the many reasons I'm proud to be part of the organization and to be counted among its dedicated professionals who do so much to protect our homeland security each and every day. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary Weinstein. I thank you for your testimony, again, for your service. The members of our subcommittee may have some additional questions, and we'll basically go side by side and ask initial questions. If we have additional questions, then we'll submit those in writing to you. I now recognize myself for opening questions. I'll start with the southern border, and as we've talked about a couple of times, the fact that we've had from the beginning of fiscal year 2021 through present date, over 360 individuals who've entered this country that in some way, shape, or form match the terror watch list. What I want to start by asking is, what is INA doing and how is that being reorganized to better know those individuals and whether or not we're detaining them? And I think the recent arrest or detainment of 8 Tajik nationals who had ties to ISIS, as reported by DHS, highlights and frames this particular question. Can you walk us through what INA is doing in this situation?
No, thank you, sir. And as we discussed, and by the way, thank you for the phone call the other day. That was a very fruitful discussion. But as we discussed, that is a major focus of obviously DHS and INA, that being the border and who's coming across the border. We have at DHS a very strong screening and vetting capability. And the whole intent of that is to identify people who might be a threat to the United States and prevent them from getting in here, either getting a visa, coming across the border, or if they're here and we learn about that derogatory information, which we're constantly trying to develop, whether they're here or not, that we pick them up and we neutralize that threat. INA plays a very important role in that effort. We obviously are generating intelligence on a regular basis, looking for threats and threat actors. We also are centrally involved in the screening and vetting operation. We actually do a lot of the support for the National Vetting Center that is the sort of the intermediary that makes sure that the information from our national security elements relating to people who might be encountered on the border gets into the vetting process, and we provide a lot of the technical support as well as the training for that. We also do a number of other things that are very focused on the border, such as we're involved in providing nominations to the TOC, the Transnational Organized Crime Watch List. As you know, there is a watch list for TOC, as there was, as we've had for 20-some years for terrorism. We nominate, based on information we get from our state and local partners, individuals for that watch list based on our intelligence work. That's another area. And then, as we said, in terms of proactive intelligence collection, we are focusing our interview efforts on the border against the threat of people coming across that border.
How did the department, on this particular issue, because these folks, as reported, came in, 8 Tajik nationals came in January. So I think it leads everyone to believe that probably 362 is at the very low end of the number. If there were 8 people who'd been in the country for, call it 5 to 6 months, and then we found them. How did the department miss that? And then how did the department catch that? And what are we doing to make sure that that never happens again?
Well, as I think you know, colleagues of ours from DHS are going to be giving you a classified briefing, I believe, right after the recess. And most of this is very sensitive and classified, so I'm very limited in what I can say on the record. But I think it is clear that when those individuals came across the border and were encountered, there was no derogatory information that came to the attention of the people on the border at that time. The derogatory information came to light later on. I can say, without getting into the specifics of the work done after they got here, that I think you've heard from the FBI and others, there was unprecedented cooperation between DHS and the FBI in working the situation. Beyond that, I think I'd have to defer to my colleagues who will give a classified briefing on this. But it has been it's been a joint effort between us and our law enforcement friends at the FBI.
When Director Ray sat here and testified in front of our committee last, he talked about the threat level being exceedingly high and used some specific words to describe that he doesn't believe that it's ever been higher. Do you think that we are in a period, do you agree with that statement that he says? And then is there a black swan event? Is there some sort of event that keeps you up at night, that INA is focused on trying to communicate, cooperate, and help between state, local, tribal, federal, all the different levels?
Well, let me start with the latter part of your question. INA is very much involved in the terrorism fight, and we are focused on the whole range of terrorism threats that we face. And then to the first part of your question, is this a time of unique threat? Every time that when you look at it, you think it's like a unique level of threat. But we are at a very fraught time, especially after October 7th, because October 7th sort of energized so many threat vectors from so many different places and bad actors, and is mobilizing potential terrorists from a variety of different perspectives. That, in addition to what was already a standing threat of terrorism, both traditional foreign terrorism threats, but also domestic violent extremism that we've seen. So the overlay of the sort of sustained, raised threat from October 7th on top of what, as we said in our threat assessment last year, was already a heightened threat, does make this a particularly precarious time in our nation's history.
Thank you. My initial time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for his round of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to pick up, Secretary, on that last point you made about domestic violent extremism, because I know both DHS and the FBI have flagged domestic violent extremism as one of the top threats that we face right now. And we're talking about homegrown extremists here who are motivated by racial or ethnic prejudice, by extremism in their politics or anti-government beliefs, by Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. But of course, it can be challenging to find and to disrupt these plots because, unfortunately, we're often talking about American citizens who have First Amendment rights as well. And so, can you just expand a little bit on INA's role in fighting domestic terrorism? What can be done to strengthen DHS's ability to counter domestic extremism? And I'll leave it open-ended like that.
Oh, no, thank you, sir. And yeah, domestic violent extremism, I think you've heard from Chris Wray and Director Wray, Secretary Marcus, and others, that just in terms of the numbers, it is the most lethal and most dangerous threat that we're dealing with right now in terms of the threat from individuals and small groups who are ideologically motivated. However, October 7th exacerbated that threat. And now you see, and I was alluding to this a little bit in the last answer, you see a little bit of a convergence of, the foreign terrorist threat and sort of ideological rhetoric being picked up by some of the domestic violent extremists here in the United States, and that's kind of fully energizing that threat. In terms of what we have to do at INA to deal with that, you put your finger on what is particularly challenging, because a lot of domestic violent extremism by definition, grows out of ideology, and a lot of that ideology is politically based, and political thought, rhetoric, communication is the most centrally core protected constitutional activity there is. So it's our job to make sure that if we're focusing our collection or our intelligence and our analytical efforts on domestic violent extremism, we're not focusing on just maybe extremist discussion, extremist thought. You're allowed to be extremist in this country. That's what our country is all about. But that we're only focusing on violence. And one of the important things that I highlighted in my opening statement was, I think one of the things that I'm most sort of gratified about that we've done since we got to INA is the creation of our Transparency and Oversight Program Office, and the success that we've had with that office, led by Andy Fawcett, who's here with me today, in really starting to put a program of oversight, strong program of oversight, into our operations, very much because of the complexity of that challenge of making sure that we don't do anything that chills the exercise of constitutional rights.
So again, thank you for that, and that's very welcome news. On the topic again of domestic extremism, INA failed to disseminate actionable intelligence prior to the January 6th attack on this Capitol, when there were individuals, extremists, who came to this building armed with weapons, with zip ties, intending to commit acts of violence. And there was open source communication that suggested that this was not just political opinions or political extremism even, but there were individuals who were contemplating violence. So can you tell us now that INA's ability to find and disseminate information related to possible events like that has improved to the point that we can be more likely to prevent another January 6th from happening again?
Thank you. That's an ever-present concern for us, that a January 6th could happen again, or some other variation of it, right? I mean, you can look at a lot of events, protests, marches, or whatever. A large part of them is constitutionally protected, is fine, but then maybe some subset of the people who are there engage in terrorism, or want to use that as a cover and a pretext for terrorism. And it's very challenging. We have to make sure that we address the second, but not the first part. That's the oversight challenge that we deal with. In terms of our capability to do that, we're very focused on making sure that we don't have another situation where we have communications that suggest violence and don't get that information out to our partners. I can tell you that in the situations that I've been involved in the last 2 years, where we've had an emergent situation, crisis situation, we have effectively gotten the intelligence out, both by product and by calls with our state and local partners. I've been on a number of 3,000-person calls the day that something happens to say, this is what we're seeing, so we're making sure to get that information out. Let me just mention one thing, though. If you look, my statement of the record was kind of long and dry and a little hard to read, but one part of it I think is important, which is there is a function that the government needs to do, which is reviewing the open source environment, looking for the indicia of coming violence. And that's where those indicia were seen back before January 6th. It was there. This is open source. We right now, INA, are very limited in our ability to actually access a lot of that information because of the authorities we operate under and the resources we have. The point of this is not to say that we should have those authorities or resources. But Congress should think about that. Somebody in the government needs to be sort of more, in a more muscular way, and obviously under all the limitations we need to protect constitutional rights, looking for that kind of threat discussion in the open source space, because that's where the next alert for the next coming crisis is going to be.
No, I think INA can play a valuable role there, and I'll yield back. I'm over time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Weinstein, is it Weinstein? Weinstein.
It's Weinstein, sir.
I beg your pardon.
No problem.
I was hearing you earlier, and I wonder if you could repeat something. You said that you identified a moment in time as giving rise to a recent substantial increase in risk of terrorism. You had said October 7, the Hamas attack on Israel. Tell me again what you said about that. Why do you point to that as the trigger of this heightened risk?
Well,
for the United States, homeland.
yeah, for the homeland. So what we had was the threat lay down that, in fact, we issued our annual Homeland Threat Assessment 2 weeks or so before that. So you can look at that. We lay down the threat, and we determined that there was a heightened threat of terrorism at that point. Then with October 7th, you then have, you've got Hamas attacking Israel, you've got Israel's response, and then different parties' reaction to both of those things. And that has animated activity by everybody from Hezbollah to the Iranian government, which, as you know, and this is public, has engaged in plotting here in the homeland, reacting to Israel, reacting to our support to Israel. We have the Houthis, who are now launching missiles at maritime targets. We have also, and I was alluding to this earlier, this interesting sort of strange connection where you do have some domestic violent extremists here who are not of the...
So I sort of, you're talking about the homeland, I sort of get why domestic violent extremists, if you see an uptick in things around the world, but as Bill Clinton once said, there's always going to be trouble in this old world. I'm not sure that the threat picture changed all that dramatically. It's not a surprise to me that Hamas wanted to do as much harm to Israel as possible. So it's interesting you point to that, and you point to the issue of DVEs. But if we talked about that story about the 8 Tajiks who came in, who you said you didn't want to talk about much here. They're not domestic violent extremists. They're here, and you said there was no. I'll get one thing and see if you can see what you've said about one statement. You said there was no, and the Secretary said there was no derogatory information about them when they crossed the border. I would think being on the terror watch list and being affiliated with ISIS-K or suspected affiliation would be derogatory. Are you saying that information was not available to you when they come across?
My understanding is that when they were encountered on the border and they were, the responsible officials checked the data systems did not have the derogatory information in there indicating.
So see, that concerns me gravely. Mm-hmm. And then there's a news story by NBC News. The chairman said before he walked out for a few minutes that he hopes we don't see another story like that, but there's an NBC News story. DHS identifies over 400 migrants brought to the U.S. by an ISIS-affiliated human smuggling network. Now, I understand maybe the Secretary suggested some of what's in that article is not accurate. What can you say about that?
I think what I can say, and I'm sure that my colleagues will be able to talk about this at greater length in the classified briefing, but that of those people who were smuggled in from that network, which, according to the news reports, has an affiliation with ISIS, there is not information that suggests that those particular individuals are terrorist operatives.
Well, see, there's one thing you didn't say. You talked about October 7, you talked about domestic violent extremists. You did not say, and it's been curious to me as I've sat on this podium for a while, no one seems to want to say opening the doors on the border has exposed us tremendously. In November 2022, Christine Abizade, director of the Counterterrorism Center, was here with Ray and the Secretary, and I asked her if her agency saw a significant threat of terrorism from the historic level of uncontrolled crossing at the southern border, particularly gotaways, and she said, we don't actually. Border security is really important. If we look at the nature of the threat and how it has evolved here in the United States homeland, it has been striking how the evolution to lone actors actually reflects how much more difficult it is for terrorists to enter into the United States. We look historically at the kind of attacks we have experienced here in the homeland. None of them have been connected to major illegal crossings or otherwise from the southern border, southwest border. I think that's clueless. I see stories about Quantico, people probing. I heard a vice admiral on Fox News saying they're seeing probing, visits a couple times a week. Are you prepared to say that opening the border has subjected the United States with an extravagantly increased risk of significant terrorism?
I'm prepared to say that we're hyper-focused on the threat coming across the border, and that's why I've detailed all the things that INA is focusing on. I'm also prepared to say that CBP, as I understand it, issues publicly the number of watch-listed individuals that they encounter on the border. So we're not trying to sugarcoat or hide the fact that there's a threat there. In fact, I'm being instructed by my secretary to focus like a laser beam on that threat.
Well, he's late coming to that conclusion, and I think, we're going to see, I just think it's inevitable we're going to see in coming years that has been ignored to the exclusion of some other far less significant risks. My time has expired. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Weinstein,
Weinstein,
for appearing today before the committee. How often do you meet with Secretary Mayorkas, sir?
I meet with him pretty much every morning when we do the President's Daily Brief together.
And your job is to give him intelligence, is that correct, regarding Homeland Security?
To give him intelligence, but also to give all our partners intelligence and receive intelligence from them and make sure that it's integrated into our operations, yes.
Recently, Director Wray of the FBI has been warning that the lights are blinking red as far as terrorism threats to the U.S. homeland. Would you agree with his assessment, Mr. Weinstein?
Sir, I'd agree that we're in a very serious time that we have to be very careful. And Director Wray lived through the 9/11 era with me together, and so he knows about threats.
Mr. Weinstein, do you believe that this blinking red terror threat that we now have in this country is a self-made, self-inflicted wound, or do you believe that our actions and our policies have had really nothing to do with that?
Well, I don't know that I'd sort of buy into either of those two propositions. I would say that just like with 9/11, one of the interesting things about 9/11 is there are a lot of studies afterwards to sort of ascribe blame, which are really healthy. And you see that it's always a combination of the bad actions of our adversaries, but also our ability and willingness to try to head those off. And
Yeah, let's talk about that, sir. Let's talk about our ability and our willingness to head those off. Because that's been the problem that many of us have tried to be the canary in the coal mine about, and the American people see on a daily basis. The American people aren't stupid, right? They're busy, but they're not stupid. They see what's going on at our southern border, and as somebody who's spent a lot of time dealing with security threats, you've got to be pretty concerned with what's going on at the southern border. And I think you know that that's a pretty big conduit that's leading into this blinking red light that now Director Wray is warning about. Would you agree with that, sir?
Yeah, as we were saying earlier today, the border is an area that we're focusing on because we're so concerned with the threat down there. Threat from a variety of different areas, not just terrorism, fentanyl as well,
Absolutely.
cartels as well.
Absolutely.
Very serious.
And we've been talking about that too.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us are wondering, is Secretary Mayorkas, is President Joe Biden, are they not getting the intel, or are they just not willing to secure the border? Maybe you can help us answer that question, sir.
I don't meet with President Biden, but I meet with Secretary Mayorkas every day, and I can tell you that he spends a lot of time making sure that I am doing everything I can and that we're doing everything we can to go after that threat.
Oh, so he's tasked you with making sure that you're doing everything you can.
On the intel side, yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Well, then you're not getting it done, are you?
I think we're doing
Really?
contributing pretty well. Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yep.
You think you're getting it done? When you look at the numbers from individuals on the terror watch list for the last administration and this administration, what are they, sir? If you know those off the top of your head.
We are part of a team, and we have a certain lane, and we're driving down that lane pretty aggressively right now. We still have a ways to go, as I discussed with the chair and the ranking member, in terms of organizationally really maximizing our capabilities. We're putting them in place. Our people are stepping up, and we're focused intently on the threat.
Well, sir, I say what I say, knowing that you're ultimately not in charge of the security of the homeland. That, unfortunately, that responsibility is above your pay grade and over your head, and you and I both know that. Your job is to provide intel, is that correct?
Yes.
But you don't get to make you don't get to cancel executive orders that were keeping the American people safe, do you, sir?
I don't have anything to do with executive
No,
order.
you don't, do you? And if you were pushing, if you wanted to push and pass HR 2, it probably wouldn't matter, would it?
Yeah, but let me say one thing. I am responsible for the national security. Every one of my team here and myself,
Yeah.
we wake up in the morning and we say we have a responsibility, and it's our job.
And
to
I appreciate
do what
that.
we can.
As somebody who served this country myself, I appreciate you taking ownership
Appreciate
and
that service.
accountability, for wanting to secure our national security, but we both know that's not getting done, which is why Director Wray himself is now saying, hey, the lights are blinking red. We have more threats than even before we did at 9/11. And it's not a coincidence, sir. It's not a coincidence at all. We've been foolish, we've been arrogant, and we've put policies in place that not only have cost the lives of Americans, but are putting countless more at risk today. And I can't even begin to tell you how disappointed and upset I am as somebody who's been sent here to try and conduct oversight and fix this problem. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Subcommittee will proceed to a second round of questioning, and so I recognize myself for an additional 5 minutes, Mr. Weinstein. And I want to sort of continue the same theme, and I appreciate your inclination to be accountable, Mr. Weinstein, and I'm not trying to suggest either that you're solely accountable. But I guess the thing I wonder is how we've gotten here. I read you the quote that Director Abizaid gave in response to a question from me, and I was trying to get at the thing. I mean, it seemed to me, I'm a layperson, you're a security expert, but I think millions of Americans have watched that from the beginning, from 2021, from the run-up from the election to 2021, immediately to an historic level of border crossing, and we were told all along that the numbers of gotaways are significant, meaning that there are a whole substantial number of people coming into the United States who are never encountering anyone, any government official. And to a point you just said that's kind of chilling. We got people who are, I don't know how the terrorist watch list works or what exactly that looks like or how people get on it and so forth, but it's incomprehensible that such a thing exists, and that even the vetting is so bad that those people don't get identified as they come across. And then I remember seeing the news article on that, and what it indicated was they were arrested, and then it listed the cities they were arrested in, and it was every major city in America, it sounded like. And but then, I sit up here as a layperson asking the questions that seem obvious to me. Candidly, sir, I don't know that I remember your coming out and making a public statement that the administration is engaged in reckless policy. I don't think you've done that. Frankly, Chris Wray has begun sounding increasingly alarmed in his rhetoric, but I read from you what the director of the Counterterrorism Center said. No, we don't really think that's a risk. And now the evidence is cropping up. So far, thanks to God, we have not seen a spectacular act of terrorism. But you're still sitting down here, and the priorities you're identifying are changes in, an October 7 attack on Israel, which sounds like a make-weight to me as a tremendously horrific incident. But it's not a change in terms of the threat picture that has always existed in the Middle East. And then you talk about domestic violent extremists. Mr. Magaziner asked you about risks like January 6th. I know that it is a stock piece in some politics in the United States that January 6th was as bad as 9/11. I don't honestly remember it that way. Maybe some American will disagree with me, or many Americans, Mr. Magaziner, might disagree. But what accounts for that? I mean, it sounds reckless to me. You did not, Ms. Abizaid has not, other members have not come out and said this is dangerous to the homeland. I'm accountable. And I'm not going to sit in my position and see the risks you're bound to see that you're not able to tell me about in detail. Why keep quiet about a risk like that we now see manifested in visits to Quantico, a Chechen conducting surveillance on an Army Special Forces colonel in Carthage, North Carolina, leading to a killing, and an Eritrean in Gates County, North Carolina, leading to a standoff with police and a shooting. It just goes on, and it's not domestic violent extremists. So what gives?
Couple things, sir. Thank you for the question, and I understand where you're coming from. If I could just clarify one thing, I didn't finish sort of the chain of reasoning I talked about. I started on about Gaza. You say that there's no change since October 7th. I think if you were to talk to the Jewish community, they would say quite otherwise. They're suffering. They're under threat in a way they weren't before, and that is what I was talking about, that the events overseas have energized threat actors of a variety of different types, foreign as well as domestic, and they're suffering from it. So
Yeah, I agree with that.
We put bulletins out about that jointly with the FBI. We've been engaged fully with the Jewish community because this is a sea change, and it's not going to end.
Yeah, I never imagined I would see what I see
It's
vested in the
horrendous.
Democratic Party, frankly, in our country. But go ahead.
It's horrendous. But in terms of the threat from foreign terrorism, you asked why I'm not saying anything more about it. I've spent every public moment talking about the terrorism threat, in particular, the threat from foreign terrorism especially since October 7th. And if you look at the Tajik situation, you'll get briefed on that. But it's not lost on us that the people who killed over 150 Russians in that theater were from the same part of the world. Okay, so, and I can tell you that Director Abizaid is working with my team and me on a daily basis. I'm going to be with her tomorrow, and we're working on a daily basis on this very threat, and with the Bureau. The amount of, and I mentioned this earlier, it really is unprecedented, the level of cooperation between us and the Bureau on these threats. And I say that with a little bit of perspective, because I was in government in the national security space up until Inauguration Day 2009. I left with the Bush administration. And then stepped out of government and then stepped back in 2 years ago. And the amount of real day-to-day operational coordination between DHS and FBI that I'm seeing now, we didn't have anything even close to that back then. So it is unprecedented, it's real, and we're taking it seriously.
Thank you, sir. My time's expired. I recognize Mr. Magaziner for 5
Thank
minutes.
you, Chairman. I appreciate it. This started out as a good, productive bipartisan hearing that I hoped it would be, and of course, now we've gone off the rails. I just want to correct the record on a few things. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, has reported a skyrocketing rate of anti-Semitic violence in this country after October 7th. We've also seen huge spikes in targeting of the Muslim community in the United States. And oftentimes, it is foreign terrorist organizations who are online through propaganda and otherwise trying to incite people here in the United States and divide us against each other. The synagogue in my neighborhood received a bomb threat just in the week after October 7th. That hadn't happened in years. It's not a coincidence. And so we cannot minimize, we cannot diminish, we cannot sweep under the rug the very real threat of domestic extremism in this country, which is on the rise. And by the way, even before October 7th, more Americans over the last 5 years have been killed by domestic violent extremists than by foreign terrorist organizations on the homeland. That doesn't mean that the foreign terror threats aren't real. They always have been, and they are heightened again after October 7th. But we cannot minimize, we cannot diminish the very real threat from domestic violent extremism here in the United States. And it's not just related to October 7th either. How many? 50 people killed at Pulse nightclub in Orlando for no reason other than it was a gay bar? People killed in Buffalo because they were African American. People killed in El Paso because they were immigrants by domestic violent extremists. The threat is real, and I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your focus on it and for trying to keep Americans safe. I will also note, January 6th was a big deal, and if you think it wasn't, talk to the family members of the Capitol Police officers who lost their lives in the days following that dark event. So let's not minimize, let's not diminish. And by the way, all of these threats are real. Foreign terrorist organizations, the challenges we're having at the border are all real. But we're not going to get anywhere by minimizing or sleeping under the rug or trying to make this a partisan thing. I'm sorry. The people chanting, "Jews will not replace us" at Charlottesville, they weren't Democrats. Anti-Semitism knows no party in this country, and I can tell you that from personal experience. Nick Fuentes, the neo-Nazi, having lunch at Mar-a-Lago is not a Democrat. So neither party has a monopoly on anti-Semitism in this country, and let's not politicize that. Now, with the remaining time that I have left, Mr. Weinstein, I want to go back and give you a chance to actually have the time to respond a little bit and talk about, particularly as it relates to the southern border, the work that your office is doing to make sure that we minimize and intercept as many threats as possible. So can you please expand on the work that you are doing and that people under you are doing?
No, thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments. I think I addressed a number of them, but a couple things I would like to mention. One is fentanyl. And the fentanyl threat is a huge crisis. We're losing 70,000 odd Americans a year. Untold damage to American families and economy. And it's unlike other drug threats, which, were labor intensive, sometimes difficult to, secrete and send across the border. Fentanyl is easy to produce. There seems to be an endless stream of precursors coming over from China. It's small and compact, can be easily secreted into a car or whatever and gotten across the border. It's really tough. And now we have sort of knockoff follow-on types of synthetic opioids. And so this is going to take an all-of-government effort, and it's going to require the executive branch, but also Congress. We are focusing on it both in terms of we're generating increased amounts of reporting on fentanyl. We're working closely in person and in regular communication with our state and local partners who are focusing on that, especially the Southwest border partners who've been very supportive of us along the border. We're, as I mentioned earlier, we are nominating people for the TOC watch list, the Transnational Organized Crime Watch List, which is focusing on the border often on cartel members. And the cartels, and I don't need to educate you on what the cartels are doing, but they are having an outsized effect on our national security because they are now going beyond just narcotics trafficking and human smuggling and all sorts of other licit and illicit activities. And they are, they're unbelievably wealthy based on the fentanyl. So we're generating these nominations for the TOC watch list so that we can better stop cartel members and affiliates from coming across the border. Those are sort of two areas that we're ramping up our activity in.
Well, I thank you for the seriousness with which you are taking on this very big challenge and all of the challenges facing our homeland as it relates to security threats. So I thank you for that work. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. D'Esposito, the gentleman from New York, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sir, for being here this afternoon. The Department of Homeland Security grants clearances to state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement officers. Once in receipt of an approved clearance nomination for a SLTT law enforcement officer who supports the DHS mission, the DHS Office of the Chief Security Officer or a DHS component with its own personal security unit will either grant the clearance or deny the clearance based on the background investigation. The committee has learned that there exists a serious backlog of issuing security clearances to these state, local, and tribal territorial law enforcement officers. In one department alone, they currently have nearly 20 members of service who are still waiting on the process of the security clearances. And it's been more than a year without any follow-up by your office for most of them, and there's actually a handful of them that are waiting 2 years, obviously resulting in a serious backlog in which law enforcement officials are unable to obtain the essential information that they need in order to conduct investigations. And it's having a negative effect on their ability to receive and use that intelligence that's critical to not only doing their job, but keeping their communities and this country safe. So really a yes or no question. Do you have a responsibility in providing SLTT law enforcement officers access to intelligence product, including some at the classified level, as well as granting or denying security clearances to these law enforcement officers based on their background investigation? Just yes or no?
Yes, we're involved in the clearance process, yes.
Okay. So are you aware that there exists a serious backlog stemming from your office being able to provide these clearances?
Yes, and I've been very focused on our role as well as the security officer's role.
Okay, well, I mean, do you agree that that if the SLTT law enforcement officers are unable to obtain this information, it's obviously going to result in a negative effect on their ability to receive and utilize or even obtain this information?
Absolutely, sir. And you put your finger on a very important issue. And I wrestled with this when I was Chief of Staff of the FBI back in 2003, back when we were trying to expand the number of state and locals who had clearances. And you can only have them be fully engaged in something involving foreign terrorism in particular if a certain number of them have clearances. When I came in, we did have a backlog. We had a pretty significant backlog for resource and procedural reasons. At the end of last year, we put together a task force that zeroed in on the backlog and largely got rid of the backlog.
Okay, so from last year to today, what was the backlog and where is the number at today?
I don't have the exact number, but I can tell you this. We largely got rid of the backlog, but then, for instance, we got 100 applications from another state.
Just
So
respecting both of our time. So we're agreeing that there's a backlog, where we see that there's an issue. You're saying that when you came in, obviously you put together a strategy in order to diminish that backlog. So if we could just take a round number guess where it was at and where it's at today. I mean, is there a significant change? Is there, a few people that have been granted clearance? Are we making a difference that's actually giving law enforcement officers the intelligence that they need, or
Yes.
are we not making a difference?
So, sir, I don't have the exact numbers, but I will get those to you promptly. But I'll tell you that we largely got rid of the backlog. It's crept back up again. We now have more resources going into that so that we don't allow the backlog to get out of hand.
So do you agree that it is a priority to address the
Absolutely.
backlog and report regularly to Congress on the progress? I mean, it seems like a common sense reform.
Absolutely. And my state and local partners are very energized by this issue. So I hear about it a lot.
So will you commit that your office will address the serious backlog so that our state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement officers obtain the necessary information to ensure the public and obviously their safety?
Absolutely. And we'll ask Congress for the resources to make that permanent.
My time's just about expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank
Gentleman
you.
yields back. I now recognize Mr. Crane from Arizona for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. IA has consistently come under fire for its social media collection targeting Americans' political views. You claim that you have safeguards for First Amendment protected speech, but by all accounts, they come with a huge loophole. If an IA officer says that collected protected speech somehow furthers one of your missions, he can collect that speech all day long. IA has claimed a vague counterterrorism need to target Americans talking about politics, COVID, environmentalists, issues, and so forth. Please explain your method for deciding which one to monitor to prevent terrorism, please.
Thank you, sir. And that goes to the crux of the issue that I was raising earlier, which is how difficult it is to do this work in the homeland where the Constitution obviously applies strongly, and it's sacred that we respect the constitutional right to free speech and political engagement. So what we do in terms of collection, as well as in terms of analysis, is we can only do intelligence work as it relates to communications, political speech, if that political speech does relate to one of our missions. In other words, if that political speech is coupled, for example, with talking about coordinating violence in a protest. Violence, absolutely actual violence, the type of thing that you were referring to, Ranking Member Magaziner, pre-January 6th. Or in the context of any kind of protest. That's an example. Or discussing cyber efforts online to undermine the integrity of our critical infrastructure. And we're seeing that by people domestically. We're also seeing it by foreign adversaries who are trying to get inside the systems of our critical infrastructure. So we have to have a mission. And we actually, in order to do that collection or analysis, and our Transparency and Oversight Program Office is doing something very important, which is we're putting in place a process to make sure that that collector or analyst identifies what that mission is before they take the step based on that mission. So we can go back and audit it and make sure that someone didn't willy-nilly collect something without a verifiable basis for doing it. And that's one of the big things, big ticket items that our TOPO, Transparency and Oversight Office, is pulling together right now.
So, sir, are you saying that you're currently putting that process in place, or do you already have that process written down and your agents are trained on that process?
We have guidance in place. We have training that has been greatly improved over the last few years. And in terms of the accounting afterwards, the audit function, that is being built right now. And we've gotten some assistance from folks like Inspector General and the GAO. We actually have the former Inspector General of DHS, John Roth, on our staff as a special government employee helping us with these kind of systems.
Are you prepared and willing to share that process, the training with the Homeland Security Committee?
Absolutely. I'm very proud to show it to you.
Great. Thank you, sir. One thing that I wanted to touch on with the remainder of my time is I represent half of the tribes in Arizona. What are you guys doing to work with the localities, tribal police, to deal with some of the issues that they're experiencing largely because of our open border, like the fentanyl deaths are skyrocketing on the reservation? Can you share with us what you guys are doing to coordinate and work with tribal police?
Thank you, sir. And I know that they have particular challenges and particular threats. And we are working our engagement office that engages with the state and locals. I think I told you at the beginning, one of the things we've done is we've elevated that whole function within the organization so it reports directly to me because it's a huge priority. And we're meeting with our counterparts, state, local, but also tribal partners on a regular basis, and particularly those who are affected down by the border, by all the activity down there. I was down on the border for a week, I guess last year in Texas, and seeing the issues there. Obviously, the same thing, issues there are playing out in the areas of the reservations over New Mexico and Arizona. So,
Is this something that your office is proactive in, reaching out to the tribes, or do you require them to come to you for intelligence?
we reach out to all our partners, but if it's okay, sir, what I'll do is I can get you a written or verbal brief about specifically what we're doing with the tribes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Undersecretary, we'll start our third and final round. Again, appreciate you being here. And if folks come in, then I'll allow them to talk, but otherwise it'll be this group here. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Last year, Politico reported, and I alluded to this in my opening statement, the DHS's Office of Intelligence Analysis has a virtually unknown program gathering domestic intelligence called the Overt Human Intelligence Collection Program. And the program has raised concerns even from within DHS, from employees within DHS, that the work that was being done could be illegal. And according to the Politico report, one unnamed employee quoted in an April 2021 document stated that INA's Office of Regional Intelligence is, quote, shady and, quote, runs like a corrupt government. I just want to get your take on not just that quote, but just in general, that program. And are you aware that some DHS INA employees share widespread internal concerns about legally questionable tactics and political pressure?
No, thank you for that, sir. And in fact, you might remember we sent you and your fellow members a very lengthy letter that explained everything we were doing in that space. So just as a quick backdrop, the way this sort of became known is we put a pause on one aspect of our human interviewing program, and that was where INA people might go in and interview folks who are facing charges. And the reason for that, and remember, I'm a longtime federal prosecutor, so I'm sort of sensitive to this. The reason for that is, while it might be perfectly legal and constitutional, it could be seen as sort of invading the relationship between that person and their criminal attorney for their criminal case because they're facing charges. So we put a pause on that. That's what sort of got in the news and became an issue. And I'm fine with that because our rules allowed for something that we should have been more careful about. We came to find out when we did an audit that we actually had never interviewed anybody in that situation, where we actually, after they'd been arraigned and received counsel and had a Sixth Amendment right to counsel attached. But our procedures allowed for it. So that necessitated us going back and re-looking at all the different guidance for our human intelligence program. And part of what I've I've laid out in detail in this statement for the record is all the work we've done in that space to redo that program, new guidance, new training, limitations, and then some of the limitations that were imposed by Congress last year, which, we sort of worked back and forth with Congress in a very respectful way to come up with the NDAA resolution that limited our ability to do that human intelligence collection. The last thing I'd say is what I said earlier, which is we're taking those resources, taking that human intelligence focus and focusing it on the border now. So most of that work is going to be, special interest migrants who are detained on the border, working with our CBP colleagues, trying to get information about the threat relating to the border.
Thank you, Undersecretary, and I'm glad you brought up products. I think there are a number of questions via letters and other correspondence that we have to DHS and INA, and just want to make sure that that the department is tracking those, but not only that, that in a timely manner that you'll commit to responding to those.
I'll look into whatever's pending, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. What's your biggest concern right now? What's the priority for INA to keep the country safe in the threat environment that we previously discussed today?
Well, to talk like a bureaucrat for a second, one priority is for me is making sure that we can maximize the ability of INA to address these threats. And that's why we have this review going on. That's why I actually welcome this, because the more scrutiny, the more guidance, and the more engagement from Congress, the better we're going to be able to improve and progress.
What's INA's competitive advantage in the IC?
Our bread and butter, and just step back for a second, and you both spoke about challenges that INA has had. One thing that I think people need to recognize, if you go back and look at sort of the founding documents, the legislation for INA, it's not clear what the core mandate for INA is. But when you sort of look at what gap it was intended to fill post 9/11, so you referred to the 9/11 Commission report, which is a brilliant piece of writing, by the way. If you go back and look at that, you see that one of the concerns that was raised is the disconnect between the hundreds of thousands of state and local, territorial, tribal, and private sector partners who have, security interests and knowledge, and the federal intelligence and law enforcement communities. Our job is to be that connection, to be that bridge, to share information about the threats facing the homeland with those SLTTP partners, and making sure that we're getting the information from them that feeds into our intelligence system. So, for example, I mentioned that we do TOC nominations for TOC watch listing. A lot of that comes from our state and local partners who tell us, fusion centers, hey, Ken Weinstein, here's the information that shows that Ken Weinstein's a cartel member. We then take that, vet it, and then get it into the TOC watch list. That's the kind of information that we need bidirectionally from our state and local partners. And that's why, as I said, when we talked about the guiding principles, that our guiding principle is, first one is our main focus is providing intelligence to the SLTTP partners. It's not necessarily getting the PDB, right? It's good to inform our federal decision makers. But the gap that we fill in the intelligence enterprise is connecting with those SLTTP partners.
Thank you. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you again, Secretary. I know you've taken steps to improve training and developing the workforce at INA. I'll just plug that I have a bill, HR 4429, the Department of Homeland Security Intelligence and Analysis Training Act, that would require standardizing entry-level basic intelligence training for all new INA employees. But could you just take a moment to explain some of the reforms you're making in addressing training of the workforce at INA?
We have improved training, and this predates me. I mean, a lot of the progress I'm talking about here, by the way, started well before me, so I don't want to be taking personal credit for all of it, and particularly in the training area. Some of the things that were put in place after, for example, the Portland situation in 2020 and then the January 6th situation early 2021 was a recognition that the guidance wasn't sufficient in certain areas and that the training on that guidance wasn't sufficient. So we have ramped up the training, the frequency and the substance and quality of the training. Our Intelligence Training Academy is much better equipped now to handle these trainings internally as well as with external partners. And then we're also, in terms of guidance, obviously, we have the Transparency Oversight Program Office, which is making sure that the guidance is put out as we need it, and dealing with current events, and then it then gets integrated into training. So for example, with the campus protests, we put guidance out, because that's a very sensitive, delicate situation. You put guidance out to our people quickly once that sort of came up, written guidance, and then followed that up with in-person, or actual training to make sure they understood where the left and right boundaries are. So there's a lot happening, and I'm happy to give you a written or verbal briefing on that.
Yeah, no, terrific. And as I read through the sort of the third phase report that you put out as part of the review, there was a lot in there, but the part that interested me the most relating to collection activities was the intent to basically embed open source intelligence collectors within the analytic centers and with sort of your partner offices. I thought that made a lot of sense. We talk about breaking down silos and kind of the over-siloing that allowed 9/11 to happen. Could you just talk a little bit more about how that's going, what the thinking behind it was, how it's going, implementation-wise, and what you think the enhanced abilities of INA will be as a result of that model?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because that's sort of a good example of some of the thought process that's going on here, and largely by the team behind me. So our open source people, for historical reasons, were sort of in one place, separate from the rest of our workforce, actually over at St. Elizabeth's, whereas the rest of us are at the Nebraska Avenue Center. And they're by themselves, and they weren't physically and insufficiently operationally integrated with our analysts. And of course, the collectors are supposed to be serving the analysts and vice versa, right? So collection is supposed to feed off of analysis and vice versa. And so, we made the decision we should move them over for those reasons, also just management reasons. It was going to be better to have them sort of with everybody else. And then we decided, I think I alluded to this earlier, that we really need to have them focus on strategic collection, not just sort of law enforcement collection about the threat of the moment, but to the point we made earlier, our main purpose is helping that police chief or city mayor or governor or tribal official understand the threat that's going to come to his or her jurisdiction today and then down the road, so that they can make resource and policy decisions. We can only do that if we have our open source collectors looking at it through this strategic lens, and that is only going to happen if they're working with analysts who are doing strategic products. So that was the thinking.
Yeah, I'll just say, as a former bureaucrat, when I was state treasurer in Rhode Island, that's the kind of nuanced thinking that I think can actually create really good results. And so I thank you and your team for that, among the other actions that you're taking to enhance the organization. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weinstein, thank you again for this opportunity. Early on in your testimony, when we were having a colloquy in the first round, I think, you talked about events, anti-Semitic protests and the like around the country. Do you guys have any information or indication whether any of that is a product of foreign malign influence? That is to say, we're all aware we've had fairly controversial foreign influence task force at the FBI, and the issue with the foreign malign influence allegedly spread through social media, and what the FBI has done to curtail that. We had the Murphy versus Missouri case just came out from the Supreme Court today, in which they said there's no standing for people who feel like their speech was suppressed to challenge that in the United States in court. But what about the protests? So it was, what I meant when I said earlier about post-October 7 things, I was just stunned to watch Palestinian flags, 300,000 people, marching through streets. I just didn't know that was the nature of the politics we had in the United States, even at this point. And then, of course, we've seen all of the protests, some of them involving significant vandalism, tent settlements, a lot of building vandalism at universities across the country. Is there foreign malign influence in that?
So you put your finger on a very critical issue. Obviously, if there were, if I was aware of anything, that'd be based on intelligence sources and methods.
So you couldn't talk about it?
I couldn't speak about it in an unclassified context. But let me just say that is an issue that we in the intelligence community focus on, not just with this round of protests, but with all protests, because we're seeing that that is one of the entries in our adversaries' menu, right? Try to foment agitation within the United States, sow discord. We've seen that over and over, and one of the ways of doing that is to try to sort of sow disorder on the streets. So
Are there programs, are there government resources that are available to deal with that in any way? So again, the Foreign Influence Task Force, that's a publicly known thing. They're supposed to be, they say they are working to counter foreign malign influence on social media. Are there programs, or I guess if you can't really speak to it, even if you can't speak to the risk, can you talk about whether there are resources that are devoted to trying to address that in any way?
sure, and once again, I'm answering as to sort of any foreign malign influence, sort of put aside whether it relates to any particular protest. Absolutely, the Foreign Malign Influence Center is up and running and is focused on that. The FBI, obviously, that is a counterintelligence threat. So if a foreign nation state or a foreign terrorist organization is trying to foment discord with any groups here in the United States, that is by definition a counterintelligence threat, and it's a subject of something that the FBI can investigate. And that's the kind of matter that they do investigate.
Okay, now my remaining time, I want to revisit this same topic a couple times that I've tried to address a couple times. I've read from Director Abizaid's response back in November 2022. I had another crack at her in November 2023, and I kind of went at the same issue again, whether the number, just sheer volume of cross-border crossing and presents a significant risk of terrorism. She said at one point, I appreciate the question. We absolutely recognize the kind of vulnerabilities that are associated with border security across all our ports of entry across southwest border and otherwise, but I would maintain, and I talk to my analysts about this on a regular basis, that as we look at the global terrorism environment, as we look at foreign terrorist organizations' intentions to try and seed operatives into the United States, we don't have indications that are credible or corroborated that those terrorist organizations are trying to do that at this time. Do you join in that opinion at this time?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of ways. That was obviously an answer at that point in time.
Has it changed?
November 2022.
This was 23, actually.
November 23. And so that was at that point in time. In terms of, what the terrorism threat there is, whether there are any particular threat actors, I would have to defer to the FBI, NCTC, and my colleagues who will give you a brief in the closed session.
So you can't really answer the question whether that still obtains?
I cannot answer what the intelligence picture is in an open setting. One way.
It just seems, I will just tell you as an American citizen observing, it seems like the Tajik story, it seems like the NBC story I related earlier, it seems like the Vice Admiral on Fox News saying we're receiving probing visits a couple times a week at military installations in the United States. I did a hearing recently in a subcommittee on the sheer, on the 1,100% increase in Chinese national migration. And but she was prepared to say that, and you can't say one way or the other today.
No, keep in mind, I'm answering the question what the intelligence picture is and telling you that I just can't do it publicly. But I can say this. We see that as an area that we need to focus on, and we're spending a lot of time focusing on it, and we're redirecting resources to focus on the border, and I've explained why and what we're doing. So in terms of the seriousness with which we take that concern, we're taking it very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Weinstein. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to read a headline that was posted about 30 minutes ago on Fox News and a little bit of the article and have you respond to it, sir. Biden DHS reveals 50 migrants still at large as ISIS-affiliated smuggling network brings hundreds to the U.S. The Department of Homeland Security has identified over 400 individuals brought to the U.S. from Eastern European and Central Asian countries by an ISIS-affiliated smuggling network in the past several months, a DH senior official confirmed to Fox News on Wednesday. Officials have arrested over 150 so far that have either been removed, placed in removal proceedings, or are currently receiving additional screening. They would not confirm of how many match the terror watch list. Of the remaining 50 individuals at large, they acknowledge that a small number may match the terror watch list. Can you respond to that article, sir?
So I'll give this generally the same response I gave before, which is, subject to the classified briefing that you'll receive on this, which I know has already been scheduled, which is that my understanding is that while there was a smuggling network and there are a certain number of individuals who came to the smuggling network,
An ISIS-affiliated smuggling
right,
network.
there's a
right?
smuggling network for which there's an ISIS affiliation. There has not been any evidence put forward that any of those individuals were terrorist operatives.
Why is this still being allowed to happen, sir?
Why is the smuggling network being allowed to happen?
Yeah, I mean, why are we consistently seeing stories like this?
I can tell you that we are very focused on the smuggling networks, and our colleagues at HSI and FBI and others are zeroing in on these networks. And a lot of what we've done at DHS is to work with the FBI to get a clear understanding of the networks out there. And this is, we spend a lot of time helping to clarify the picture of what the networks are so that we can
Right.
anticipate whether any of those networks are involved in terrorism.
And I appreciate that you guys are doing that, but wouldn't you say, sir, that you can have all the intelligence in the world, but if you don't have leaders who are willing to execute on that intelligence, it doesn't really matter, does it?
Well, also, what you do need also, and this is one thing I think it's important, and you asked about what I need or we need, we could use more resources to vote to the border, both DHS but also INA. The more people we have down there interviewing folks along the border, the more likely we're going to find out about bad actors coming across.
And you say that because you know that your headshed, your leadership, won't actually change any of the policies, right?
I say that because that's a truism, that right now we're operating with relatively scant resources. And
Let me ask you this then. Would we need to surge more people to the border, the same exact southern border that we've had now, if your administration was actually doing its job in protecting the American people?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into sort of platitudes one way or the other than to say that we're going to go where we see the intel need to be. And from when I went through my confirmation hearing, and your colleague from Texas asked me about the border, and I said, based on what I know as a private citizen outside the government still, that's an area where we need to focus our intelligence efforts. That hasn't changed since I got in. So we're going to continue to focus there.
Yeah, let me shift real quick to the advisory board. According to a May 17, 2024 department press release, DHS decided to rebrand the experts group as the Homeland Intelligence Advisory Board. The 19 members of the disbanded experts group have simply been reconstituted as members of the board. This is troublesome given that it appears DHS is attempting to mislead Congress and the American public by simply renaming a controversial advisory committee. We have also learned that DHS has exempted this board from public notice, reporting, and open meeting provisions that are normally required by the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Why is this, sir?
Well, let me just clarify one thing, because whenever I hear a question with the word mislead, I feel I've got to respond to that. There was no misleading done at all. In fact, if you look at the settlement agreement, the public settlement agreement that ended the litigation that led to us disbanding the original group, we said we have the right to constitute a new group under the FACA law. And we said that in black and white. The other party, the litigation, accepted it. The judge accepted it.
That's great. Real quick, sir, is it true that Mr. Brennan and Mr. Clapper are on this advisory group?
They were on the original experts group, and as we announced, we will be seeking...
Didn't both of those gentlemen say that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation?
Both of
Why would you want, my question, sir, is why would you want guys that are putting out very false information publicly to the American people, why would you want them on your advisory committee?
I want people who can help us do what I'm talking about here, which is transform an organization. We're trying to transform an intelligence organization. There's one person in the world...
Is telling the truth a part of helping you guys?
Could I answer, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's one person in the world who's recently transformed an intelligence agency, the CIA, John Brennan. I don't care what his politics are. I care that he's honest with us, he brings his perspective, and he donates his time to us to help us...
Transformed it good or bad?
That's for others to understand,
Yeah,
to assess.
exactly.
But I want to hear that experience. Jim Clapper, once again, I don't care what his politics are, but he was the director of national intelligence. He coordinated all the different...
I don't care what his politics are as long as he doesn't weaponize them.
Exactly.
But clearly he has.
Well-
And that's why I asked you, didn't both of these guys say that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation? and these are intelligence guys. Everybody knew that that laptop was
Chairman.
legitimate. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letter that the gentleman from Arizona is referring to, which outlines why 4 dozen intelligence officials who signed it believed, based on the available information at the time, that the
Can
emails.
the ranking member state the title of the article?
It's the letter that the gentleman from Arizona was referring to. Without
objection, so ordered.
Signed by multiple intelligence
Without
officials.
objection, so ordered.
Yeah, thank you.
I thank the witness for his testimony, for your valuable testimony today. I thank the members for the questions. The members, like I mentioned at the beginning, may have further questions, written questions for the witness, and we ask that you respond to these in writing. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for the next 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.